William picked up the large greyish object and examined it carefully. "A mushroom," he announced. The other outlaws looked at it doubtfully. "Bet it's a toadstool," said Ginger. "There's been people killed eating 'em, thinking they were mushrooms." "Well, I bet this is a mushroom," persisted William. "I'm going to take it home and ask them to cook it. I'll give it to my mother for a present. It's her birthday next week." "A mushroom won't count," said Douglas. "Not for a birthday. They don't." "I bet it's a toadstool," said Ginger again. "I can tell by the colour. A mushroom's sort of white." "Well, this is sort of white," said William. "Go on, then," said Ginger. "Eat it and see if you die." No, I don't like 'em raw," said William. "I'm going to get it cooked." "They'll just throw it in the dustbin and tell you not to come bothering 'em," said Henry. This sounded so probable that William did not contradict it. They were passing Miss Tressider's house. Little Miss Tressider owned an elderly, cantankerous, short-sighted brown dog called Nero, who now stood at her gate and growled softly at the outlaws as they passed. William stopped. He liked to be on friendly terms with the canine population of the village. "Hi, boy," he said, in a conciliatory tone. Nero growled again. William held out the hand that contained the dubious mushroom. Nero advanced, smelt the offering, and suddenly, before any of them could stop him, swallowed it. "Gosh!" said William, dismayed. "Crumbs!" said Ginger. "I jolly well hope it wasn't a toadstool." "Come away, quick," said Douglas apprehensively. "'Fore she sees us, she'll say it's our fault if it dies. She'll kick up an awful fuss." It was at tea-time that the bomb fell. "I met Miss Tressider in the village," said Ethel carelessly. "The poor old thing was in such a state. That dog of hers is dead." William stared at her. It was a toadstool after all. Evidently no one yet connected him with the death of the dog. That, at any rate, was a relief, but not much of one. The brand of Cain seemed to descend on William. He rose from the table with a muttered excuse. "Oh, don't you want any more tea, William?" said his mother. "No, thanks," said William. "Have you a headache, dear?" William laughed harshly. Fancy asking someone if they'd a headache when they'd just murdered a dog. He went out into the hall. The next step was obvious. He must get Miss Tressider another dog. He had just sixpence halfpenny. He didn't know much about the price of dogs, but he thought that he ought to be able to get quite a good one for sixpence halfpenny. He'd meant to buy a pistol with the money, but that would have to wait now. Next morning he walked all the way into Hadley to the pet shop. A small, stout, supercilious-looking man, rather like a Pekingese, came forward. "Yes, can I help you?" I want a big brown sort of dog, please," said William. The man winced slightly at the sort of. "We only keep pedigree dogs here." "Well, yes, that's the sort I meant." The man winced again. This small, grubby boy didn't look like the potential purchaser of a pedigree dog, but one couldn't be certain of anything with the modern child. The man led the way to the back of the shop and opened a large kennel. William's heart leapt. The brown dog inside was the very double of Miss Tressider's late Nero. How much is it?" he said casually, fingering his 2 coins affectionately, and hoping it wouldn't be quite sixpence halfpenny. £10, said the man. "Oh, well, he's not quite the sort I want. Thanks very much. Good afternoon." There must be another way, if only he could think of it. And then it came to him. What about Miss Mortimer's Hereward? He looked exactly like Nero, and Miss Mortimer had 3 dogs, while Miss Tressider now had none. If he took Hereward and tied him up in Nero's empty kennel, Miss Mortimer would still have 2 dogs, which was enough for anyone. He made his way quickly to Miss Mortimer's house, where luck was with him. Hereward stood just inside the gate, looking bored and friendly, and no one else was about. Hereward responded readily to William's overtures of friendship, and followed him willingly, wagging his tail. William led him along the lane and round to the back of Miss Tressider's house, fastened him to a chain by Nero's kennel, and set off again. Hereward, however, was feeling betrayed. He'd been looking forward to an adventure with William, but now found himself chained up beside a strange kennel. He lifted up his head and howled desolately. Miss Tressida, drawn by the eerie sound, came to the window and stared out. She blenched. She'd been sorrowing for poor dear Nero and had just said to herself, if only he would come back to me for 1 hour. And there he was, even though she'd seen him buried with her own eyes just yesterday. He'd never howled like that in his lifetime, of course, but clearly he'd come back to her with a message. She opened the window. "Nero," she said. "What is it? Nero." Hereward continued to howl. And then Miss Tressida thought of Miss Bullimore. Miss Bullimore had a handbook on palmistry and did fortune-telling at the local fetes. She was generally thought to be psychic. Perhaps she'd be able to interpret Nero's howls. Little Miss Tressida flung on her hat and got out her bicycle. Miss Bullimore was interested, but slightly bemused, for Miss Mortimer had just paid her a visit in deep distress because her Hereward had disappeared. She had begged Miss Bullimore to use her psychic powers to discover where he was. But, in spite of her handbook on palmistry, Miss Bullimore's psychic powers were somewhat uncertain. They tended to work best after the event. When something had happened, Miss Bullimore often impressed her friends by saying that she'd had a feeling that it was going to. She was somewhat disconcerted by Miss Tressida's request. But then she thought no one would be able to prove that her interpretations of Nero's howls didn't mean whatever she said they meant. And that was the main thing. So she agreed to cycle back with Miss Tressida. Meanwhile, William, on his way to the old barn, had been pursued by those raucous, desolate howls. He stopped. He couldn't possibly give Miss Tressida a dog that howled like that. He wouldn't mind a howling dog himself. In fact, he'd rather like one. But experience had taught him that elderly maiden ladies have peculiar ideas about noise. He was just passing Mr. Cornish's house. Mr. Cornish had a bull terrier called Oberon, a nice, quiet dog, an old dog with a weak chest. William had often heard Mr. Cornish say it was more trouble to him than it was worth. Miss Tressida wouldn't mind its weak chest. She was always getting colds herself, and it could share her medicines. Oberon, large, whitish-pink, and ungainly, sat by his kennel. William unfastened his chain, and Oberon lumbered after him, wheezing joyfully, seeing himself as a puppy out with a boy, making elephantine runs and rushes at nothing in particular. It was the work of a few seconds for William to undo Hereward and fasten Oberon to the chain instead. Hereward vanished down the road like a streak of lightning. Oberon sat down heavily. He seemed happy, and anyway he couldn't howl because he wheezed so much he could hardly even bark. William felt he'd spent quite enough time on this whole business, and set off once more towards the old barn. Miss Tressida sat down weakly on a chair near her back door. "He's stopped howling," she said to Miss Bullimore. "Do see if he's still there, dear. I daren't. I don't really know if he's visible to anyone else, but of course you'll be able to see him, because you're psychic." Miss Bullimore put on her psychic look and went to the window. Oh, yes, I can see him," she said triumphantly. "Yes, I can see him." Perhaps she really was psychic. "What's he doing, dear?" "Sitting. Just sitting. Just a white dog sitting." "White?" shrilled Miss Tressida. "White? Has he gone white? Oh!" She dropped her face in her hands. "Oh, well, of course he would be. Oh, my poor Nero. I can't bear to look. Is he fading away?" "No, dear, he doesn't seem to be fading away." At that moment, Miss Mortimer arrived at the front door. She was angry and breathless. She'd been told that her Hereward was in Miss Tressida's back garden. She demanded to see the dog that was tied up to Miss Tressida's kennel. "Oh, I'm afraid you won't actually be able to see him, dear," said Miss Tressida sadly. The three of them gazed through the window at the plump, solid figure of Oberon.
But it's not Nero,
gasped Miss Tressida.
Well, it's certainly not Hereward, said Miss Mortimer.
Let's go out to him, said Miss Bullimore, who was feeling relieved that she hadn't risked her psychic reputation by interpreting Nero's message. Just as Miss Tressida opened the back door, Mr. Cornish arrived. Mr. Cornish was as small and peppery as Oberon was large and placid, and was intensely annoyed to have been informed that Oberon had been seen chained up in Miss Tressida's garden.
"Now look, you'll hear of this again," began Mr. Cornish. "You'll hear of this."
Meanwhile, William's conscience was still troubling him. He oughtn't to have left a white dog in place of Nero. Besides, it wasn't fair to give Miss Tressida an old dog like Oberon. It should have been a young dog, and a brown one. He knew that Farmer Jenks had a young, scatterbrained brown collie called Victoria, whom he'd heard the farmer say he was despairing of ever training as a sheepdog. So, it would be a kindness to Farmer Jenks to relieve him of her. William approached the farmyard and hung over the gate. Yes, there was Victoria, trying to fraternize with a broody hen. William whistled. Victoria cocked her ears. She was bored with the hen and decided to accompany this friendly boy wherever he wanted to take her. She frisked round him happily as he made his way, once more, to Miss Tressida's house. William walked boldly round to the back of the house, then stopped. The small lawn seemed full of people.
"You'll hear of this again, Miss Tressida," Mr. Cornish was saying. "You'll hear of this."
It is probable that, alone, Victoria and Oberon would not have fought. It is probable that if Hereward and William's own beloved Jumble had not arrived simultaneously at that moment, the end would have been happy and peaceful, for everyone except, perhaps, William. Hereward had been annoyed on arriving home to find his mistress not there. He had tracked her to the scene of his recent humiliation. There was a fat white dog there who was probably the cause of the whole trouble, so he flung himself savagely at it. Victoria joined in furiously, and Jumble, disliking all of them impartially, leapt joyfully into the heart of the fray. William withdrew slightly, and found Miss Tressida's housemaid standing beside him.
"Oh, poor old thing," she said. "She is having a time of it, and no mistake. That there Nero run over yesterday morning."
"What?" said William.
"Oh, haven't you heard?" said the housemaid. "A great big van it was. Flattened him out, poor old thing. Driver blew his horn like mad, but Nero, he was that deaf. Oh, poor old thing."
William stared at her blankly. So, Nero's death had had nothing to do with the mushroom. He was sorry for Nero, of course, but, well, he'd taken all this trouble for nothing. Well, he'd wasted enough time. Thank goodness he'd still got his sixpence halfpenny. He'd go and buy that pistol right now before anything else happened. It was no use calling Jumble. Jumble never left a fight till there was no one left to fight with. William walked cheerfully away, his hands in his pockets, quite unmoved by the nightmare sounds of barking, growling, screaming and shouting that were growing to a climax in Miss Tressida's garden. It was, after all, nothing to do with him. Continuous rain had put a stop to the usual activities of the outlaws. The game of Red Indians, if played in a perpetual downpour, palls after an hour or two, and even the absorbing pastime of pirates loses its savour when it has reached a certain pitch of dampness. So the outlaws assembled in the leaky old barn and watched the rain despondently. And then Douglas said, quite suddenly, "Let's have a newspaper." They looked at him with interest. "A newspaper?" said William slowly, as though he were weighing the idea judicially. "Yes," said Douglas. "Write one, you know, and someone be editor. The editor's a sort of chief man." "I'll be that," put in William hastily. "Now, how are we going to start?" "Got to think of a name first, I suppose," said Douglas. There was silence while the outlaws thought. "Outlaws' Daily Times," said Ginger at last. "That means doing it every day, whether it rains or not," said Douglas. "Not likely." "Outlaws' Weekly Times, then," said Ginger. "Not every week, neither," said Douglas very firmly.
Why not Outlaw's Telegraph? Said Henry. Because it's not a telegraph, said William. It's a newspaper. Well, why not have Outlaws and District Times, said Douglas, same as the one we take at home. This title met with no objection. The name Outlaws and District Times was adopted. Now we've got to write news, said William cheerfully, producing paper and pencils from one of the damp packing cases that furnished the old barn.
But there isn't any news, objected Henry. Nothing's happened except rain.
We'll say it's been raining then, said Douglas encouragingly.
You can't fill a newspaper with saying it's raining, said Henry.
Newspapers don't only say news, contributed Ginger, with an air of deep wisdom. They sort of write about things they don't like and about people doing things they don't like. William brightened. We could easily do that, he said. Let's all start writing about people doing things we don't like, and start now, straight off. The Outlaws signified their assent. There was silence, broken only by the sound of the rain dripping on and through the roof of the old barn, and the groans of the Outlaws in mental travail. Then suddenly, through the silence, came a shrill voice.
"Hello, William, darling."
William looked up with a groan. Violet Elizabeth Bott, gumbooted, mackintoshed, sou'westered, stood smiling happily in the doorway. Violet Elizabeth was a maiden of 6 years, with a lisp, an angelic face, and a will of iron. William dreaded and respected Violet Elizabeth Bott.
"I made them let me come," she explained. "I wanted to find you all and play with you, so I screamed and screamed and screamed till they let me."
She beamed around triumphantly.
"What you doing?"
"We're writing a newspaper, and we don't want girls," said William firmly.
"But I want to write a newspaper too."
William scowled. "Well, you're not going to," he said. Violet Elizabeth's blue eyes filled with tears. That was her first weapon.
"I can write too, I can," she said plaintively. "I can write newspapers too, I can. I'm a good writer, I am. I can spell too, I can."
"Well, you're not going to spell here," mimicked William heartlessly. Violet Elizabeth dried her tears. She saw that they were useless, and she did not believe in wasting her effects.
"All right," she said calmly. "I'll scream then. I'll scream and scream and scream till I'm sick."
More than once William had seen the small but redoubtable lady fulfil this threat quite literally. He watched her with fearsome awe. Violet Elizabeth opened her small mouth. It's all right, said William brokenly. "Come on, write if you want to." Violet Elizabeth came on. She wanted to. She found a piece of grimy paper and a pencil with a broken point, and sat down, beaming ecstatically, on the ground by William. Violet Elizabeth adored William. She smiled around on them all.
"What shall I write?"
she demanded happily. "Write anything," snapped William.
"I'll make up a crossword puzzle,"
she said. William threw her a glance. In spite of her general objectionableness, she certainly had ideas.
"What you doing, William?"
she said sweetly. "I'm writing a serial," said William with a superior air.
"You're writing a serial, William?" she said. "How nice."
"People," said William ferociously, "people what write newspapers aren't allowed to talk."
"All right, I don't mind."
Again there was silence. All the Outlaws were working hard with frowning brows, bitten pencils, dishevelled hair, and agonized, grimy countenances.
"I finished my crossword puzzle,"
piped Violet Elizabeth. "You can't have," said William.
"Well, I have. They're there."
She passed it to him. "One down, what you have drops of, one across, opposite of cat." William looked at this for a long time. "Well, what is it?" he said at last.
"Can't you guess it, William? It's cough and dog. C-O-F, cough."
"You don't have drops of cough."
"Yes, you do, William. You have cough drops. I've had them. I've had cough drops, I have."
"You don't spell 'em like that anyway," said William.
"Well, how do you spell 'em?"
William, who was rather hazy on the point, quickly changed the subject. What's the opposite of a cat?"
"Dog, William."
"Dog isn't the opposite of a cat."
"Yes, it is, William, 'cause I know it is."
"Well, it's a rotten puzzle," said William with contempt.
"It's not, William. It's a nice one. You ought to give a prize of £100 for guessing it, like they do in newspapers."
"Well, I'm not going to, so shut up."
"All right, William,
said Violet Elizabeth.
I don't mind.
Violet Elizabeth, having gained her main object, could be disarmingly meek. For some minutes there was silence, broken only by the sighs and groans of the editorial staff. Then Violet Elizabeth raised her voice again, shrill and unabashed.
I don't see what good a newspaper is without any crimes.
They looked at her. She met their gaze unflinchingly. I wish you'd stop interrupting, said William. But he added, because her words had secretly intrigued him, what do you mean, saying that a newspaper isn't any good without crimes?
There's always crimes in newspapers. There's crimes and police and people going to prison. If you're going to have a real newspaper, somebody ought to do a crime.
All right, said William, nettled by this invasion of his editorial province. All right, go and do one then. Violet Elizabeth leapt to her feet.
Yes, I will, William,
she said sweetly.
I don't mind.
A sigh of relief went up as the small form disappeared into the rain. And again there was silence in the barn. Violet Elizabeth trotted happily across the field, over the stile, and into the main road, intent upon a career of crime. In the road she saw a young man with curly hair. The young man was an undergraduate of Cambridge who was staying at the village inn for a week's fishing. For the first 2 days the fishing had given him complete satisfaction. On the third day he had seen William's pretty 19-year-old sister Ethel, and after that he had spent most of his time hanging about the road that led past the Browns' house, taking unauthorized snapshots of Ethel whenever she passed him on the road. Today the young man looked excited despite the rain. He had heard that Ethel might be attending the vicar's tea party this afternoon, so he had made friends with the vicar and been invited to the party. He was on his way to the vicarage now. In his pocketbook reposed those snapshots of Ethel which he had managed to take without her knowledge. A small child in gumboots, mackintosh and sou'wester was coming down the road. She seemed to be looking about her expectantly. He smiled at her. The young man liked children, chiefly because he had not met many. The little girl looked up at him with a confiding smile. He slowed down.
Hello,
said the little girl with a bright smile.
Hello,
he replied. He was early. He'd while away a few minutes with this friendly child.
Please sit on this stile with me,
said the little girl. He was rather flattered. There must be something about him that appealed to children. He wished that Ethel could see this little child turning to him with such flattering friendliness and confidence.
All right,
he said.
Let's.
The stile was very wet, but they both wore mackintoshes. They perched there, side by side, in the rain. The child did not speak. The young man felt that he ought to say something.
It's very wet today, isn't it?
He said brightly.
Yes,
said the child simply. It had not been, he felt, a happy remark. It was not a remark that, if Ethel had overheard it, would have remained forever in her heart a precious memory.
Show me your money,
said the child imperiously. The young man obligingly took out his pocketbook. He was rather glad of the excuse. It was quite 5 minutes since he had looked at that most engaging snapshot of her, 3/4 back view, just as she was turning out of her garden gate into the road. He looked at it now.
There's my money, he said kindly. These are £1 notes, these are 10-shilling notes, and this is a £5 note, and these are photographs of a most beautiful...
He grabbed at the stile, nearly overbalancing. The small child had seized his pocketbook and was already disappearing round the bend of the road. Hastily reconstructing his ideas of innocent childhood, the young man followed in swift pursuit. He caught her up at the end of the road and held her arm.
"Give me that back,"
he said sternly. She uttered a scream that turned the young man's blood cold. Then she stopped screaming and said, quite composedly,
"I'll scream again if you don't let go of my arm."
Broken in spirit by that terrible scream, the young man let go her arm. He knew that another scream like that would have shattered his nerve completely. Then he saw that the child, still firmly clasping his precious pocketbook, was wriggling through a gap in the hedge and was now in the field beyond, running towards an old tumble-down barn at the further end. The young man followed, keeping his pocketbook anxiously in view.
"Come and see what I've done,"
shrilled the young person. He followed her into the old barn. 4 boys in various stages of dishevelment were engaged in a rough-and-tumble fight on the muddy floor. The young man recognized one of them with a leap of his heart as Ethel's brother. Pieces of paper, evidently laboriously written upon, were trodden into the mud. The 4 boys sat up and gaped at the 2 intruders. The small child waved aloft the pocket-book triumphantly.
"I've stolen it," she said. "I'm a criminal."
The young man rubbed his eyes. Am I mad? Or am I dreaming? The small child had taken affairs into her own hands.
"You've got to be the judge," she said to William. "And you," to the young man, "you tell them how I stole your purse and put me in prison and put all about it in the newspaper and my photograph. You must have my photograph in the newspaper because they always do with criminals."
She then laid down the pocketbook on the largest packing case and opened it. The photograph of Ethel fell out. Suddenly, someone appeared in the doorway. The young man went purple to the roots of his ears. William groaned. "Oh, William, you are an awful boy," said Ethel. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Mother says, have you been out in all this rain? And if you have, go straight in and change." "Well, I haven't," said William. "I've been sheltering here." "Oh, you do look awful," said Ethel, gazing at him despairingly. Then her glance fell upon the open pocketbook and upon her photographs. Who took these?" she said, in quite a different tone.
I did,"
stammered the young man, who was now a dull petunia shade.
"But why?"
said Ethel in a very sweet voice.
"I say, it's stopped raining," said Ginger joyously from the doorway. "Let's go out."
"Why?" said Ethel demurely, with curling lashes lowered over peach-like cheeks. "Why did you only take me side and back view? I look nicer from the front." The young man gulped.
"May I take you from the front?" he said.
Ethel took up the snapshots.
"I think you'd better," she said, "to make a complete set. We'd have to find a suitable background, of course."
The young man took a bold plunge.
The background I'd like is Fairy Glen. Yeah, we'd pass the inn on the way, and I'd call for my camera. It stopped raining, and the sun's coming out. Will you?"
Fairy Glen was at least 2 miles away. Ethel's blue eyes danced, and her pretty lips quivered.
"Why not?"
she said. The Outlaws and District Times lay trampled in the mud on the floor of the empty barn. The Outlaws were being Red Indians in the neighbouring wood. They had completely forgotten the Outlaws and District Times. It had whiled away a wet afternoon, and for the Outlaws it had served its purpose. Ethel and the young man were on the road which led to the Fairy Glen. They were getting on very well indeed. The Outlaws and District Times had served its purpose for them too.
April the 1st was a day generally enjoyed to the full by William, but this year something seemed to have gone wrong. Not one of his efforts had been successful. His elder sister, Ethel, had calmly put on one side, without even attempting to crack it, the empty eggshell that he had carefully arranged in her egg cup. His elder brother, Robert, had removed the upturned tin tack from his chair before sitting down, and had placed it so neatly upon William's that William had been taken unawares. His father had refused even to raise his eyes from his newspaper when William shouted, "Look, father, there's a cow in the garden!" And his mother had merely murmured, "Yes, dear," when William had informed her that Ethel had been bitten by a mad dog on her way to the village. His attempts to make April fools of his outlaws had been no more successful. They were all indeed so much upon their guard that none of them would answer the simplest question or pay heed to the most innocent remark. At last they abandoned hostilities and formed an offensive alliance against the other boys of the neighbourhood. But not even this was successful. The other boys of the neighbourhood also were too well up in the rules of the game to be taken in by the well-worn tricks the outlaws played on them. Advised of the near approach of bulls, runaway horses, motor cars out of control, they merely made long noses at the outlaws.
informed that sweets were being given away at Mr. Moss's sweet shop, that a circus had just arrived at the other end of the village, that Farmer Jenks was riding round his farmyard on his old sow, they merely remarked, "Yah, April Fools yourselves." "I wish we could find someone that had forgotten it was April Fool's Day," said Henry. "Tell you what I'd like to do," said William. "I'd like to make someone really important an April Fool, like the King or Parliament an April Fool." "You couldn't." "Yes, I could. I could easily. I could ring 'em up and say that an enemy had landed, and then they'd call out the army and march down to the coast and find no one there. I bet they'd be April Fools all right." "You don't know their telephone number," said Ginger. "No, but I could look 'em up in the book, couldn't I?" "You'd probably get executed," said Douglas. "Yes, I know. That's why I'm not going to do it. Not to the King and Parliament, anyway. But I'd like to make someone important an April Fool, but not as important as the King and Parliament. Let's think who's the most important person living here." "The vicar?" suggested Ginger. "The doctor," suggested Douglas. "Yes, I think the doctor," said William. "He'd be easier to make one anyway. I know. I've thought of something to bring 'em both in." Followed by his outlaws, William made his way up to the doctor's front door, knocked at it smartly, and informed the maid who opened it that the vicar was dying and would the doctor please go to him at once. For answer, he received a box on the ear that nearly made him lose his balance. He rejoined his friends, rubbing his boxed ear tenderly and filled with righteous indignation. "Huh! Suppose it was true, and they'd let the poor vicar die. Well, I think she's the same as a murderer, that woman is. I've a good mind to go and tell the vicar that she's as good as murdered him. I bet I was as near dead as you could be, too, with a bang like that on the side of my head. She ought to get put in prison for murdering both of us. I'm jolly well sick of April Fool's Day anyway. I vote we go and play somewhere." It was decided that it would hardly be safe to play in their own village. Their own village was too full of their enemies, eager to use the noble festival of All Fool's Day as an opportunity of getting even with them. They could not safely relax their guard for a moment in their own village. "Let's go over to Marley," suggested Ginger, "and take the football with us." Marley was a village about 2 miles away. The outlaws were comparatively unknown at Marley. "Good," agreed William. "We'll get a bit of peace there." They set off briskly across the fields to Marley, and there found a vacant plot of land on which to hold a football match. "A beastly house next to it, of course," said William morosely, "and they'll be sure to make a beastly fuss every time the ball goes into the garden. I don't think there's a single place left to play in England that hasn't got a house next to it, all ready to make a fuss the minute your ball goes into its garden. Sometimes I feel I don't care how soon the end of the world comes." "Well, come on, let's begin to play," said Ginger. They began to play, and in a few minutes, as William had prophesied, their ball went over the wall into the garden of the house. It was a high brick wall with no convenient foothold on it, so they went to the gate to survey the enemy's ground. There they found that to get round to the side garden where their ball was, they'd have to pass a window where a haughty-looking lady sat at a writing table. Clearly, it could not be done. "We'll have to go to the door and ask," said William cheerfully. William's spirits always rose at a crisis. "I'll put on my polite look." William's polite look, though much admired by himself and his friends, was, in reality, a sickly leer. It certainly did not seem to ingratiate him with the housemaid who opened the door. "Please, can we go round to your garden to get our ball, if you don't mind? Thank you very much." The housemaid stared at him disapprovingly, disappeared, and soon returned to say shortly, "She says it's an intolerable nuisance, but you can this once." "Thank you very much," said William, widening his leer and making her a courtly bow. "None of your impudence," she said, and slammed the door in his face. The outlaws went round to the side of the house and found the ball. They returned to the plot of wasteland and continued their interrupted match. In 5 minutes the ball had gone over the wall again. They considered the situation with some dismay. "I'm not going to ask again," said William firmly. "She'll start murdering me, same as the other one did if I go. You better go, Ginger." "All right," said Ginger, and began to compose his features into an imitation of William's leer as he walked up to the front door. The same housemaid opened it, received Ginger's dulcet request with obvious indignation, then retired to report it to her mistress. She returned almost immediately. "She says you ought to be ashamed of yourselves pestering like this. She says you can get it this once, but she says she'll send for the police if it goes on." Ginger retrieved the ball and rejoined his friends. "Gosh," he said, "more like dragons than human beings round here, aren't they? We'll take jolly good care not to let it go over again, anyway." They returned to their game, but 5 minutes later, an energetic and unguarded kick from Douglas sent the ball once more into the forbidden garden. "Well, it's you or Henry to get it now," said William. "Me and Ginger's had our turns." "They all look pretty savage about here," said Douglas. "They look as if they'd kill you as soon as look at you. I votes we go home and leave it." "Oh, yes, I dare say you do," said William. "It's not your football, it's my football, and I'm not going home without it, so there." "What are you going to do, then?" "I'm going to get it. I'm going to crawl round to the garden on my hands and knees so she can't see me from the window and get it." "I'll come with you," said Ginger. "So will I," said Douglas and Henry. There was no need for more than one to go to fetch the ball, but when there was any danger, the outlaws liked to face it together. In single file, on hands and knees, they made their way to the garden and retrieved the ball. In single file, on hands and knees, they began their journey back. But as they were passing beneath the window, Ginger sneezed, and the amazed and indignant face of the lady of the house appeared in the window, disappeared, then reappeared, now more indignant than amazed, at the door. The outlaws rose sheepishly to their feet. The lady stood barring their path and giving eloquent voice to her indignation. "Disgraceful! Disgraceful! I've a good mind to send for the police and give you in charge for trespassing. If I ever see any of you inside this garden again, I'll send for the police at once. Go away this minute. If I knew who your parents were, I'd write to them most strongly." The outlaws fled, William clutching his beloved football. "Well, it's time to go home anyway," he said. "Yes, it's nearly 12, said Ginger, pretending to consult his watch, which never went for more than 5 minutes, but in reality glancing at the church clock that showed above the trees. "Nearly 12, said William wistfully, "and we've not made anyone an April Fool. It'll be the first year I ever remember that we've not made anyone an April Fool." "We've not been made one ourselves, anyway," Ginger reminded him. "Course not," said William scornfully. "Catch anyone making April Fools of us." "That's not the point. The point is that we've not made anyone one. It seems awful somehow not to have made anyone an April Fool on April Fool's Day." "Well, it's not quite 12 yet," said Ginger. "It's not too late." "Yes, but who is there to make one here?" said William. At that moment, a boy was seen coming towards them. He was fat and pale, and he looked both stupid and conceited. The outlaws took an immediate dislike to him. "Let's make him one," whispered William. "Yes, but how?" said Ginger. "I know," said William. The boy had come abreast of them now. He gave them a challenging grimace. "I say," said William with well-assumed friendliness, "what do you like best? What sort of cakes, I mean?" "Coconut buns," answered the boy promptly. William gave a short, surprised laugh. "Well, that's a funny thing." He pointed to the house that had been the scene of their escapade. "You see that house?" "Yes," said the boy. "Well, the lady that lives there, she always gives coconut buns to any boys who come to ask if they can get their ball from her garden. If you want some coconut buns, all you have to do is go up to the door and knock and ask if you can speak to the mistress of the house. And when you get to her, all you've got to say is that you're one of the boys who've been playing ball just outside her garden this morning, and the ball's gone over again, and may you fetch it. And when you've said that, she'll give you some coconut buns." The boy stared at them. "Go on," William urged him, glancing at the clock and seeing the fingers perilously near the fatal hour. "Go on. We want you to have those buns, because you look hungry. See here." Desperately, he took a treasured whistle from his pocket. "See here. I'll give you that if you'll go and say it." The boy took and pocketed it without a word. William's urgency communicated itself to the others. They felt that their very honour depended upon, somehow or other, making this boy an April Fool before 12 o'clock. And look here, said Ginger feverishly. I'll give you this penknife too, if you'll go quick. We want you to have those coconut buns. The boy pocketed the penknife too, stared at them for another moment, then said, "All right," and walking up to the front door, rang the bell. The housemaid opened it, and he was admitted. The door closed. The outlaws danced a silent dance of triumph and delight at the gate. Then they waited impatiently for the fleeing form of their victim to issue, pursued by the wrath of the redoubtable lady of the house. Nothing happened. "Perhaps she's rung up the police," said William, looking anxiously down the road. "Well, if she has, we've made April Fools of them," said Ginger triumphantly. I hope she's not murdering him," said Douglas. "We shall get into a beastly row if we've got him murdered." But at that moment, an upstairs window was flung open, and the boy appeared at it. He held a coconut bun in one hand, the whistle and the penknife in the other. He grinned and munched and waved his spoils at them exultantly. What are you doing there?" stammered William. "I live here," shouted the boy. "It's my home. Yah-boo! April Fools!" He laid down the coconut bun and took up a pea-shooter. The clock from the church tower struck 12. "April Fools!" called the boy again. The outlaws turned and began to walk slowly down the road. A pea caught William neatly just above one ear.